Please enter your numeric passcode followed. Your passcode has been confirmed. Please stand by as you are joined to your conference. There are 38 parties in conference, including yourself.
To him, he's done an admirable job of innovation, of outreach to the community, of tracking potentially problematic officer behavior, and a number of other things that have greatly eased the relationship between the police and the community during a difficult time. Our second presenter will be Deputy Chief Clark Kimmerer of the Seattle Police Department. He's a 21-year veteran of the Seattle PD and has served as chief negotiator for the hostage negotiation team, training officer for the SWAT team, lead planner for the Goodwill Games, and a number of other things. Is now Deputy Chief of Operations, overseeing patrol operations, the Investigations Bureau, and the newly formed Emergency Preparedness Bureau. I noticed that Winthrop is trying desperately to keep up with me on the slides, because we didn't exactly discuss the order in which I was going to do this, so I apologize for that. We have Chief Stryker on our screen now. I have just introduced Deputy Chief Clark Kimmerer. Our third presenter will be Professor Robert Kaminsky of the University of South Carolina. Bob is an assistant professor in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of South Carolina. He previously worked as an analyst for the National Institute of Justice, a component of the Office of Justice programs here at the Department of Justice, and we are, as we indicated in our invitation, partnering with the Ash Institute at Harvard to bring you this presentation. Professor Kaminsky has also worked for the New York City Criminal Justice Agency and other research centers. His particular research interests include violence against the police use of force, less lethal weapons, and public perceptions of the police. And finally, Professor David Klinger of the University of Missouri, St. Louis. Dr. Klinger is an associate professor in the Criminology and Criminal Justice Department at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. He previously worked as a patrol officer for the Los Angeles and the Redmond, Washington police departments, and has published as a researcher since that time a number of articles on the subjects of arrest practices, use of force, how features of communities affect the actions of patrol officers, and terrorism. Professor Klinger is the author of a book entitled Into the Kill Zone, A Cop's Eye View of Deadly Force. Our group of experts will be moderated by another expert in the field, Chuck Wexler, whose photo I think you saw a minute ago, and here he is again. Chuck is, as many of you know, the executive director for the Police Executive Research Forum and has held that position since 1993. Many of our listeners are well acquainted with PERF, a membership organization of law enforcement chiefs from the larger police agencies in the country. And they are engaged in police and criminal justice research, technical assistance, and a number of other efforts to improve policing and assist police departments. Chuck personally has spearheaded an effort to confront and to discuss with candor police-minority conflict and racial profiling issues. More recently, he was one of the first to call for more public information on the use of tasers by police officers in the field, and he has been heavily involved in efforts to examine the deployment of this technology and its safest use. Chuck, as a matter of fact, has served as an evaluator for Harvard's Innovations in Government project, so he too has a connection to the Ash Institute. Prior to his service at PERF, he held a number of key positions in the Boston Police Department. He worked as an assistant to the first director of the Office of National Drug Control Policy and has headed professional development at the International Association of Chiefs of Police. So this is our group, and what I'll do is, after asking Chuck to facilitate some introductory remarks by each of the panelists, we'll then invite questions from our audience. These questions, be explained to you, I think, will be sent electronically. Mayor Steve Goldsmith will be sorting these out and will pose as many questions then to the panel as we have time for. So with that, let me turn this over to Chuck Wexler. Chuck?
Thank you, Deborah Daniels, and I want to thank the Justice Department and Harvard for this opportunity to really talk about something that I know a lot of police chiefs care about, a lot of community people care about, and what an interesting innovation to sort of bring everybody together very quickly in an hour time and really talk about this. So thank you to you, Deborah Daniels, and also to...
I got it on my phone, but I don't know how to put it on speakerphone.
And also to you, Steve Goldsmith, for your leadership in this area. So with that, my general style is just right to it. And I'd like to ask, if I could, Clark Kimmer from Seattle. Chief Kimmer, Seattle in many ways was a turning point with the WTO demonstrations. You all in Seattle were really faced with something that policing had not been faced with before. So I guess my question to you is sort of opening up this discussion from both a mass demonstration standpoint and then from an individual confrontation standpoint. How has less lethal technology really had an impact on how you all do your job up there?
Well, first, thanks, Chuck, for inviting me to participate in this. And I've got some slides that I don't necessarily have to rely on, but focusing on what we've learned throughout the years. Let's start at the beginning. You mentioned it in your introduction, and that was WTO, which was at the time the largest coordinated incident or series of incidents of civil unrest to confront a fairly small and, to say, not totally prepared police department. Obviously, we were confronting at that point some pretty smart, pretty well orchestrated and fairly criminal confrontations and scenarios between protesters and the police, and they forced us to kind of revisit our general deployment and the options we needed to bring out in the field. Following on that, as you'll note in my slide, we had an incident called Mardi Gras, which was the opposite of organized. In fact, it was a frenzied and alcohol-fueled example of what the crowd dynamic can degenerate into, and again, put the police in the middle of it. And then finally, you see in the middle there an incident referred to as the David Walker shooting, a mentally disturbed individual who confronted the police with a knife and basically forced the requirement to use lethal force. All those things for us combined to take a look at how we provide options to our officers in terms of what we now call less lethal force. And to get at that, we formed two groups, an internal study group called FORGE, Force Options Research Group, which exists to this day, and then an external community-based study group. Interestingly, they both came up with the same conclusion, which is that we needed three basic elements to our approach to less lethal force. First, and maybe foremost, crisis intervention training for officers, as many as we can on the street. Second, a short-range, less lethal option, which we decided to be the taser, and then finally a mid-range option, which we implemented as the drag-stabilized beanbag round. Let's go right to the point, though. I mean, we've had 4 years now of this program, and let me concentrate on the taser because I think that's the one that emerges in the headlines more often than others. We've used the taser now 619 times to date. We have use of force packets prepared for every taser application. I review each and every one of them. And as a part of that process, we evaluate whether the program is on track, what we need to modify, what training needs to be implemented. And here's kind of the critical things I think we've come up with. If we go back to the slide on lessons learned. First, we need to have continuing education, which we do. We have what we call taser summits with all the practitioners to get them basically informed and trained in the latest trends and findings. We continue to improve the clarity of our standards. Our policy, I think, is a model one. And we invite the kind of participation of the taser practitioners in the development of that policy. We have a phase-in approach, obviously, to learn from the field experience as well as what's going on across the country. And there's a lot going on right now in terms of taser use and policy and training. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the accountability feature, which includes my own personal review as well as a systematic review of every single taser application. Here are the big ones that I think are coming up for us, and I think these are national ultimately in scope. The use of the taser as not in the dart mode, but in the touch stun mode, is coming under a lot of scrutiny, both here and elsewhere. Its effectiveness is limited. It leaves marks. It is often used where I would venture to say better alternatives to force should be used. And in particular, when there's repeat applications, both of the dart mode, but certainly of the touch stun mode, we see kind of a problematic pattern emerge. We are looking then at putting in a priori prohibitions and limitations through policy. For example, that the touch stun will not be used more than 3 times without a supervisory review post-event, and calling medical services to evaluate the person in the field. Particular people will be identified as having higher risk, those under clear influence of drugs and alcohol or mental illness. People are young, people are very old, people are pregnant, that sort of thing. That, to me, is one of the key points of focus in looking at our policy and training. I know that was an awful lot in a short period of time, and let me conclude by saying that it was my earnest hope that Tom Stryker's photograph would be put in my place, because he really is much more photogenic than I am.
Thank you, Clark, and we've never met.
Trust me, Clark's right.
Clark, this is Chuck Wexler.
Dave Klinger, by the way.
Just put that on the record. So now I want to turn to Tom Stryker, the police chief in Cincinnati. Chief, you in Cincinnati have been sort of in the forefront on this issue. You've obviously had a number of cases that have forced you to kind of look hard at what you're doing, and you've had tremendous success with tasers. Can you talk a little bit about the implementation of tasers, what it has done, if you've been able to assess that in terms of decision making, and how it's impacted on your overall use of force and injuries to officers and suspects alike?
I think I can, Chuck. As a matter of fact, you're well aware we had a highly publicized incident back in November of 2003, where we had a couple of officers in a very high-profile situation. Their incident was recorded through a mobile video recorder camera inside of a police car, where they had an occasion to use force against a very large man, weighed about 350 pounds. It was a tremendous effort on the part of everyone there to bring this person under control, and unfortunately, the man wound up dying at the end of it. Later, a coroner's report indicated to us that he had severely high blood pressure, was under the influence of cocaine, phencyclidine, and some other substances. And it was an ugly scene that occurred there. It was broadcast not only nationally but internationally, and brought attention here to us in Cincinnati again. We had begun looking at tasers before that incident. In fact, all the way back in February of that year, when Chief Harold Hurt, who's now in Houston but was in Phoenix at the time, at a major city meetings, made arrangements for us all to meet and have a briefing from the people at Taser. Obviously, one of the big concerns we had here in the city was the price of it. It was about a $1.4 million project for us to get tasers and implement the use of those tasers here. Unfortunately, we didn't get to purchase those tasers and implement the use of them until after that very tragic scene that occurred here in November of that year. Since then, though, we did have the opportunity, with the help of the Department of Justice and a sizable grant, to be able to purchase those tasers and implement those tasers here in the Cincinnati Police Department. And I think one of the keys to implementing that whole program was an educational process that occurred before then, and that we did a lot of work with the Taser Company and with other agencies around the country, particularly Phoenix Police Department, and obtaining some information from them, and then being able to bring together a program that certainly educated not only our media here and our politicians here, but was taken out into the community, and a number of seminars done with community leaders, with community residents, and with a number of community activists here to show them exactly what the taser was, how it works, a full explanation of it, and ask for their support in the implementation of this program. It was very successful. That implementation was very successful, and we were able to start the program early last year. We now have a year's worth of statistical information that we can depend on in evaluating that. If we can flip over to slide number 7, you can see that we started with the tasers in February of last year, and by June of last year we had full implementation with 1,025 officers trained. And interestingly, and we thought this was important, we offered to the officers a chance to experience exactly what the taser does, and that is, in the training itself, they were allowed to experience the exact feelings that occur, so they were hooked up to a taser. We had 812 officers. About 80% of the police department voluntarily include themselves in that experience. We thought that was important, number one, so they could know exactly what the taser felt like, experience it itself so they would know what they're administering, and also, number 3, to demonstrate to the public that we believe that this is a safe instrument. In fact, we believe it so strongly that about 80% of our department, including myself, subjected themselves to the experience of a taser being applied or deployed on them. We thought that was very important and drove home the confidence that we have in this instrument very much so. If you look over at the next slide that's there, you can see that we're very close with Seattle. We've had about 629 separate instances where the taser has been deployed, about 527 of those instances very successful, so that's about an 85% success rate for us with the taser. But more interesting than that is we've got about 10% of the deployments themselves, and we count this as a deployment where an officer turns on the taser and actually puts the red dot, displays a red dot to a person while they're issuing the warning that the taser is going to be used unless they cease their behavior. And in about 10% of those instances, people complied. So the taser itself actually avoided the necessary to use force, the actual use of force itself, and we think that's important. In fact, I just was given a statistic here this morning that between the third and fourth quarter, from the third into the fourth quarter of 2004, we've experienced a 16% decrease in the actual deployment of the taser. So people are becoming aware of it being out there. They know and understand what it's for, and they're actually starting to comply with just the threat of using the taser itself, or a warning, if you will, that the taser will be deployed if they don't slow down and cease their behavior, resistant behavior. It's also important, you can see on the screen here that we've got 75 cases where people were injured as a result of using the taser. In those 75 cases, most of those are abrasions or scrapes where a person has fallen to the ground. And five of those people, there were fractures that were suffered, but I'm very happy to say that those have been diagnosed as a hairline type fracture, and one that did not necessitate any type of follow-up medical treatment. So that was very important for us. There's some pie charts that are included in here on the next two slides that are there to give you an idea of exactly how much compliance there was and how we achieved that compliance, actual cartridge discharge versus a drive stun, and or what we call the red dot compliance, which is actually the display of the instrument, as I said, not the actual use of it. And also there's the missed target. I'm sure other departments that are in climates like us realize that at this time of the year, with a lot of heavy clothing on, leather jackets in particular, we're experiencing a almost no effect from the taser at all. The leather coat seems to be providing a tremendous amount of insulation factor from that taser itself. Those are important things, and I think those statistics are important. But Chuck, I have to tell you that our experience here has been more of a question about this, more than a question about the taser itself. We felt that it's important to continue to try to drive home the message to people that the instrument or the weapon that an officer is using out there in the field is not nearly as important as the decision-making process that's being used by the officers and also by the department in the training. If you go all the way back to the second slide that's in there, we illustrate to people here, both in the political arena and also in the summits that we have with our neighborhoods and our residents and our activists here, that there's a three-prong test that has to be met each and every time an officer uses force, and that's a matter of force. It could be just a simple non-compliance all the way up to and including the use of deadly force, and that's the three-prong test that's put forward by the United States Supreme Court standard in Graham versus Connor. Very simply, as you see there, the severity of the crime, whether the suspect poses an immediate threat to the safety of officers or others, and or whether the suspect actively resists arrest. And it's very important that people understand that. There shouldn't be a hysteria out there over what type of instrument or what type of weapon an officer is using. More so, we believe that people should know and understand and be aware of what a police officer or a police agency actually has to be in compliance with if that decision is made to actually use force. We try to illustrate that on the next, I guess it'll be slide number 3 there, on the next slide that we have, and exactly how our use of force department policy is in compliance with that. And we really put an emphasis to our officers, and we try to emphasize to the public that it's extremely important for officers to try to achieve some type of control through, number 1, advice, number 2, warnings, and number 3, persuasion. And I think that's incumbent upon all police agencies. I think that we should all have our emphasis and the focus of our intention on avoiding the necessity to use force. We should have training out there that's illustrating the necessity for people to use their minds, for people to use their experience, for people to use good communication skills, and convincing people that we're all much better off if we go through the process that's set up by the legal system and try to achieve some type of resolution without the necessity to resorting to the use of force, and that's extremely important. We emphasize to people also, as you can see on the next slide there, in the operational application of law and policy, that what's required, a reasonable suspicion to stop and detain a person or probable cause to arrest, that noncompliance or resistance by the subject must be present. It's not just that an officer can walk out and say, okay, I think I'm going to make a decision to use force on this person. And that's what's so important in the educational process to the public, because we've come to find and realize so very often that questions arise about police conduct, not necessarily because of what the conduct is, but it's more because why the police do what the police do. And we found that through that constant effort to explain the actions of officers, constant effort to illustrate exactly what our training stresses and what our training requires in making those decisions, that people have begun to come to a greater understanding of exactly what the mission of a police agency is and what the legal requirements are for that police department to be in compliance with standards set forth by the United States Supreme Court. And we believe that decision-making process is what's so very important, and we believe that it's important for the public to understand that also.
Okay, Chief, thank you very much. That was really an excellent overview of the issues, and I know, if time permitted, you would certainly be able to go even further. And in fact, I think that emphasis on decision-making is very important for people to consider and think through. This isn't simply just a mechanical exercise. Now, I want to back off a little bit from tasers per se, because I think part of the issue over tasers today is the implementation issues and what impact they are having. And many police departments know that they're having a very positive impact, but somehow that discussion is being taken up with controversial incidents that are happening. One way to look at this is, I want to ask Bob Kaminsky if when there was this implementation of pepper spray, we went through similar kinds of situations, and you, as a researcher, you've looked at pepper spray. What are the lessons that we can learn from the implementation of pepper spray that you can share with us? Bob Kaminsky?
Yeah, hi, thanks, Chuck. I think there are a number of overlapping or parallel issues regarding the use and implementation of pepper spray or OC and tasers, and I'm most familiar with pepper spray from 3 research projects or 3 studies I conducted on it in the past. And what I'd like to do is go over some of the areas where I think there is some overlap or commonality regarding issues, and one area is just kind of some common or general concerns, and we've already heard several points from the chief and the deputy chief regarding these, so there may be a little bit of overlap. But the other area I'd like to talk about is some research issues regarding both of them, and I think there is something that can be learned from prior attention given to pepper spray and research on it. Regarding some common or general concerns, of course, it's not new to anybody, but a major issue is, what's the contribution to in-custody deaths, if any? I think it's a growing controversy regarding tasers. I think it's a very difficult thing to tease out. Would suspects have died regardless of exposure to taser or right? I think there are a number of more policy issues that could be paid attention to regarding OC and tasers. I think it was already mentioned, for example, avoiding the use of the taser on obviously pregnant women, perhaps elderly or very young. We had an incident in Florida recently, the 6-year-old boy. Other persons with health problems, although obviously officers are not always going to be aware of health problems such as asthma, perhaps in regard to OC and heart conditions. I think another issue is placement. Where should OC and tasers be placed on use of force continua? Should officers be authorized to use them on, say, passive resistors or verbally non-compliant suspects, or should there be more active resistance before they're used? I think there's been some concern, at least in the media, regarding whether or not the adoption of less lethal weapons might have a force net-widening impact. There was a recent New York Times article that made that suggestion, at least in one agency. And that probably depends upon where they are placed on the continua. If it's lower down, then it could have potentially a force-widening impact. I think there's some growing concern about, I'm not necessarily the Cincinnati or Seattle agencies. It sounds like it's a voluntary exposure, but I'm not sure that's the case for all agencies. But, are officers required to be exposed to OC or tasers prior to their being able to use them on the street? I think there was a recent lawsuit where an officer, was shot with a taser, and the muscle spasms caused some type of back injury. So there are a number of commonalities, I think, for both of these less lethal weapons. In terms of research, and I'm talking about field research, not the development of technology or medical-related research, because those are areas that I really don't have any expertise in. But I think there are two basic areas in research where there's some commonality. And there are others I'm not going to talk about, such as perhaps public perceptions or opinions of tasers and, say, OC. But the two that I am somewhat familiar with is, one, empirically, how effective are these weapons when they're deployed on the street? And what are the correlates of effectiveness? In other words, under what conditions are they more or less effective? And what are the benefits of the adoption of tasers and OC? For example, do they reduce the number of assaults on officers? And do they reduce the number of officer injuries in general and suspect injuries? If you look at the early media coverage of pepper spray, vendor assessments of effectiveness and even some departmental assessments indicated pepper spray was effective 90 to 100% of the time. And some of the research I've done and others as well suggest less optimistic assessments. In my own work, I found it was effective 70 to 85% of the time, depending on how you define effectiveness. So, for example, are you defining effectiveness as when the person is, say, immediately and completely incapacitated, or did it assist? They might have not been immediately incapacitated, but did it still help make the arrest? That'll give you different figures in terms of just how effective it is. Taser International, for example, if you go to their website, they say it's effective about 95% of the time. And they have a specific definition that they use. If I look at, when I was looking at the slides from Cincinnati earlier, I think it was slide number 11, if I'm correct in my interpretation, if you were to use immobilized as the criterion for effectiveness, it would suggest that it's effective about, the taser is effective about 65% of the time. But if you use immobilized plus gain compliance / partial effect, it would suggest it's effective about 83% of the time. Now, I'm not sure if that's including or excluding misses, and that would be, an important factor. I think in Seattle, from the information on their website, I think they reported taser were effective about 95% of the time with verified probe contact, and they define as effective if it disabled or partially disabled the suspect. So I think effectiveness is important to look at, whether it's effective 90% of the time or 85% of the time. May not be that critical. But certainly, looking at the correlates of effectiveness may be important, particularly for officers and safety issues. Suspects on drugs. Research on OC strongly suggests that OC is less effective with persons under the influence of drugs. Taser International, if you look at their figures, it doesn't look like drug use impacts taser effectiveness, but I still think it's an important area to research. And of course, the Taser International figures are all based on voluntary reporting, so it's not like some kind of random sample of taser incidents. The other area I just want to go over a little bit is in regard to some of the benefits of the adoption. In the past, regarding research on pepper spray, and currently with evaluations of tasers, it's widely reported that the adoption of these less lethal weapons leads to a reduction in the incidence of use of force overall, reduces the number of assaults on officers, the number of injuries to officers and suspects, and fewer police shootings. All really good things. But from a research perspective, one of the issues is that most of the assessments use a simple before and after comparison of the data, looking at these various outcomes. In research parlance, this is called a one-group pre-test, post-test design, and it suffers from a number of threats to validity, a number of shortcomings. And I'll just give a couple examples where this has come to light. One, if there's already a declining trend in something within a police department, say there's already a declining trend in the number of assaults on officers, when pepper spray or a taser is introduced, it can be difficult to know whether the introduction of pepper spray contributed to that decline or caused the decline if it's already declining. And generally, you need more sophisticated types of analyses to tease that out. Just one example was an NIJ-funded study carried out by the IACP, the 1995 Pepper Spray Evaluation Project, and they used Baltimore County PD data. And Steve Edwards was the lead author of the report, and good friends with Steve. And one thing they concluded, and they had a graph in the report showing a decline in the number of assaults following the introduction of OC. However, this was assaults on officers. There was already a decline in assaults prior to the introduction. So we went back to the Baltimore County Police Department following the release of that report and collected additional data, and we used a more rigorous statistical methodology. And we did, in fact, find that it reduced the number of assaults on officers. But there's other research that suggests that OC didn't have the beneficial effects, even though it appeared to. There was a study funded by NIJ's Office of Science and Technology. It was carried out by Bowling and Gaines, It's a 2000 report that's downloadable off the NCJRS website, where they examine the impact of the introduction of OC on officer and suspect injuries in three police departments, law enforcement agencies. One was the North Carolina Highway Patrol, Winston-Salem Police Department, and Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department. And they all showed apparent declines in injuries to officers and suspects following the introduction of OC, but Bowen and Gaines used more sophisticated methods, and what they found was that there were fewer officer injuries in the North Carolina Highway Patrol that they felt was caused by the introduction of OC, and there were fewer suspect injuries in Charlotte Mecklenburg that was associated with the introduction of OC. But in all the other cases, they were unable to rule out reductions in injuries, and they couldn't conclude that it wasn't due to chance or some other factor or cause. So the research component can be important. And just as another example, within this context, again, you've probably seen there are a couple New York Times articles in 2004, and one of them cites, the Phoenix experience, and Phoenix noted about a 50% drop in officer shootings in 2003 following the introduction of the taser. But that New York Times article indicates that shootings increased, and quote, at a rapid pace in 2004, which would seem to not go in line with the logic that tasers reduce shootings. Now, I can't verify that. I did take a look at the Phoenix Police Department's website, and I couldn't find the shooting data there. But it's just a cautionary note. I've no doubt that tasers are undoubtedly useful and largely effective and very useful for law enforcement. But I think there is empirical research yet to be done that can help inform policy practice as well as the public regarding the adoption of tasers and any other less lethal weaponry. And I'll stop there.
Thank you, Bob. I know we have some police chiefs that are listening into this, and they're probably saying, yeah, we wish we had all of the research before we made these decisions, but I think some of them would say being a police chief is like, driving a car and trying to change a flat tire simultaneously. They're making these decisions with the best information they've got. One of those people who I think might be able to weigh in here, because he's been in both worlds, is Dave Klinger, who you've been a police officer and now you're a researcher. And can you shed some light on how less lethal devices have impacted on police-citizen encounters?
Sure. I think what I'll do, Chuck, is talk about some of the changes that have come about in terms of police-citizen interactions and what it might mean down the road in terms of not just tasers and OC, but beanbags, plastic baton rounds, wooden dowel rounds, whatever the case might be, the whole array of less lethal weaponry that has come down the pike in the last really 10 years. And one of the things that we have to understand is that whenever we introduce a new device, it's going to require fresh tactics. The officers are going to have to use it in a new way. Obviously, it's a new technology, and so what this means is we have to train officers, and there have to be policies and procedures in place about when it's supposed to be used, so on and so forth. One of the things that has come down the pike in terms of impact munitions, for example, is typically there will be some sort of a statement that if you're going up against an individual who has a deadly weapon, let's say he's got a knife or a machete, so on and so forth, you're not going to pull out your drag-stabilized beanbag gun until you've got somebody there who can provide lethal coverage, those sorts of things. But it gets a little bit more fine-grained than that, because what happens is when we introduce a new option into police work, what this creates is additional decisions that police officers have to make. And Chief Tom was talking about the notion of the critical element in all of this with the taser usage in Cincinnati is the question of judgment and the question of decision making. And it isn't something that happens overnight. It takes a while for law enforcement officers to understand the parameters of when a particular device is going to be helpful, when it's something we want to stay away from, so on and so forth. And also, when we bring these less lethal devices in and we start talking about a situation where we're going to have a minimum of 2 officers where you've got a suspect with a lethal device, oftentimes it's more than 2 officers. It might be 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10 officers. And then what happens is you've got this incredibly complex social system built up where you've got maybe 1, 2 suspects and multiple officers. Who's going to be doing what? Who's going to have what role? So on and so forth. And so it becomes very important for police executives to give the officers guidance about how they are to behave. Who's going to play what role? Is the field supervisor going to be doing X, Y, or Z, so on and so forth? If there isn't a supervisor, who's going to be in charge? An awful lot of things that we need to think about. And we've spent a lot of time today talking about citizen safety and the improvement in citizen safety, and then the improvement in officer safety that can potentially come from these less lethal devices. But I would also suggest that there's a pernicious downside of less lethal devices when it comes to the safety of officers. What happens is occasionally police officers get in a mindset that this new tool is something that is going to work for sure. I can count on it, and they employ the device, and then they become overconfident because they believe they've got compliance before they in fact have compliance. They move too rapidly, and disaster occurs. The best example of this was out in Tacoma, Washington, just south of where Clark is up in Seattle. Several years ago, a SWAT team confronted an individual who was armed with an assault rifle, and to make a very long story short, they hit him a couple of times with some KO-1 rounds, and the suspect went down, and the officers immediately rushed him. And before they could get to him, he he was able to arm himself with his assault rifle and murder one of the officers. And so oftentimes, these sorts of things that nobody thought about, there can be blowback or revenge effects, as a guy named Edwin Tenner talked about. And I was looking at the Cincinnati PowerPoint, and one of the things that it talked about was situations where Cincinnati officers were using tasers against individuals who were armed with handguns. Now, I don't know all the details, but that sort of raises the hair on the back of my neck a little bit as a former cop, thinking, okay, these might have been absolutely appropriate, but if what we're doing is we're teaching police officers that you're supposed to be using less lethal devices against individuals with firearms, that creates a problem for the officers. It also, in my opinion, could create an unrealistic expectation on the part of the citizens. And so there's all these different things that layers and layers of information that we need to get so we can get a handle on how these devices, as they get diffused across American law enforcement, how they're going to change the complexion of police-citizen interactions. Another thing that was brought up from the Cincinnati presentation was that, sometimes people are wearing heavy coats, so on and so forth. Well, I think one of the things we'll probably see down the road is people that want to defeat tasers hear about this, so then if they're going to go out and act a fool, anticipating a confrontation with the police, they may well, in fact, put on some heavy clothing, so on and so forth. So when we have these new technologies, it sets in motion an evolution that we don't really know, or an evolutionary process, and we don't really know how it's going to get played out. We introduce a new technology in law enforcement, the crooks start changing the way they behave, then law enforcement has to modify, and all this is played out with police officers trying to make these vital decisions without complete knowledge. And so I think that the advent of the taser, just like OC spray, just like the impact munitions, we have to wait and see how things are going to play themselves out. But those are some of the things that I think we need to be thinking about in terms of officer safety, in terms of officer decision making, in terms of the training that the officers need.
Thank you, Dave. Let me ask a question, and then let me maybe turn it back to Deborah Daniels or Steve Goldsmith. It seems to me that Seattle and Cincinnati both had to act very quickly on use of force issues, probably without as much information as they would have liked. Clark, perhaps you first, and then Tom. How do you make these kind of decisions when you don't have as much information as you'd like? What goes into your thinking, into your process? And I think Tom Stryker talked about decision making to be foremost. That in the final analysis, you really were still talking about decision making. But in Seattle and Cincinnati, you both have had to act very quickly. What goes into that?
Well, first, this is Clark, Chuck. First thing we look at is what the parameters of our options are. The laws concerning the use of force are, in Washington and elsewhere, pretty well established, well defined. No reasonably effective alternative to the use of force appears to exist, and the amount of force used is reasonable. So then you go to the market, I guess, and the experience of other agencies, and what the best science provides to see what fits in terms of force options. The time we made these decisions, there wasn't a lot out there. In fact, the taser, the M26, was brand new to the market. And obviously being looked at with a great deal of interest, but not a whole lot of research and statistics behind it. I sent officers out to the agencies that were deploying them at the time: Sacramento, San Diego, I believe Phoenix. Got on the circuit, as it were, as Chief Krolikowski did through the major city chiefs and through PERF, and attempted to get as much information as we can or could at the time before contemplating deployment. Went inside the department with experts from the SWAT team, and then outside the department to the medical community at Harborview Medical Center, and then through convening a citizen group, independent of the police department, posed the same question we were trying to answer. What were appropriate options for the deployment of force, other than lethal force, in response to this, cascade of serious situations that officers on the street were confronting? And then finally, given all those limitations, we took the course of saying, all right, we're going to go slow. We're going to pilot this. We're going to have a limited deployment, handpick people, put an awful lot of energy into accountability and review, and see what evolves in the course of that limited deployment. That was how we approached it, and I would venture to say we probably wouldn't do it differently if we had to do it all over again.
And Chief Stryker, I mean, one of the I think frustrations that many people out there have is it seems like that the whole, if you will, taser story, we're just seeing one part of the story. In other words, where there have been problems, and in fact, there's that the larger story has not really been put in perspective. Officers save citizens who've been saved, and so forth. How does when you implemented this, what were some of the thoughts going on? You had to be concerned that sometimes by doing something you can get more in trouble than by not doing something. So what were you thinking when you went to this strategy?
Well, we took a lot. For the last 5 years, actually, we've been taking a look at our source of injuries, not only to our officers, but also the source of injuries to our citizens, and come. Not a surprising realization, but I think all police agencies understand the same thing, that the more physical contact there is between officers and citizens, the greater potential there is for some type of injury to occur to one or both of the people involved or all the people involved in that situation. And that's why we really like the idea of the taser, because the taser itself really separates the officers from the citizen. If a person is making a decision to act up in some way, shape, or form, we saw the taser as being perhaps the least intrusive option that an officer could possibly have, in that even if you use something as simple as chemical irritant, it does for some people take an hour or 2 hours for the effects of that to wear off of them. Certainly if someone's getting hit with a nightstick, there's always the potential for some type of a bone fracture, or if it's an errant strike with the stick and someone unfortunately gets struck in the head, there's a potential for death there. Even if it's not that serious of an injury, certainly getting hit with a PR-24, you're going to have a deep bruise. It's not going to go away in 5 seconds, which is what the option the taser provides us with. And it also provided us with the opportunity to evaluate the usage of it. And as you can see, even in our PowerPoint presentation on the second to last page, and I have to apologize for this, I just found out about this morning, the second to last page shows an 88% reduction in officers being injured. That's wrong. They used the wrong denominator. It's actually a 47% reduction in officers that were injured, and in prisoners being injured or citizens being injured through these same types of experiences. It was down 37%. And we think that's something very positive here, that people are not getting injured, both officers and citizens alike, on a regular basis. And it's one of the things that we kind of hung our hat on when we made our decision after consulting with other agencies around the country, and quite frankly, we were very fortunate. The Ohio State Patrol had been using tasers for about 1.5 years or 2 years already. So we had a real good source of information right here in the state of Ohio, and we depended on them tremendously. But, the final analysis, I said a little bit earlier, it was about a $1.4 million project for us, and that was a big decision considering that the financial picture here in Cincinnati isn't a whole lot better than it is in other cities around the country. And also, as I said before, we were fortunate that the Department of Justice moved forward for us and supplied us with about $800,000 towards that project and able to implement it, and we're very, very satisfied with the experience so far. But I have to agree with the two professors that spoke. There is a lot of study that needs to be done, a lot of analysis that needs to be done. And if I could clarify for Professor Klinger, we are not substituting the use of the taser in situations where people are armed with a gun. We've been very fortunate, actually, that in 25 instances over the past year, officers were chasing people for an unrelated, not for a weapons offense, for something else, used a taser when the person fell. A gun either came out of their pants or was found on them. In fact, the same thing occurred just this past weekend. An officer chased a person, got into a struggle, used a taser, and the person had 2 firearms on him, unbeknownst to the officer at the time. But no, we're not substituting the taser for what otherwise would call for an officer to resort to the use of a firearm.
Thanks for clarification, Chief.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask, I'd like to call on Steve Goldsmith. Many of you know Steve Goldsmith. He was mayor of Indianapolis, but he was also a prosecutor. When you listen to this from a public policy point of view, Mayor, what do you think? I mean, what are your messages what do you want your police chief to be thinking about? When you don't have all the research that you need, and you know you need to be making a decision, what is your advice going to be at police chief and to the citizens in your community?
Well, any mayor who's been a district attorney for 2 or 3 terms may give a different answer than a mayor who hasn't. One way to answer your question, Chuck, is I'm looking at the questions from the audience, and James Odell from Kettering has asked a question which provides one way I would think about answering your question, which is, there's a risk in everything, right? There's a risk in traffic stop. There's a risk in any use of force. And so he asks, and I think as a mayor talking to my police chief, the question is, how do you educate the public that the net amount of harm, if you will, that results from the use of a taser is positive. It's not police work is dangerous to everyone. So I think listen to this conversation so far, I think it's been really important because it's this kind of continuum of force and how you train your officers to match the kind of degree of resistance, and how you convince the public that tasers often, even if they do harm, are less harm than otherwise. So I think it raises some really interesting public education questions. And I guess the last comment would be, it seems like it'd be really important in advance for the mayor, the police chief, correctional officers, anybody, the people who are publicly using tasers, that they all be on the same message, because it'd be too easy for the mayor to criticize the police chief or an officer after use of a taser unless there was agreement in advance.
Steve, I'm not able to get those questions on my screen. Are there other questions we should be dealing with?
This is how I operated as mayor. I make sure that every question to the chief came through me so I could censor them. So we set this up this way. Chuck, let me just do a couple of these and then turn it back over to you. And I know Deborah has to leave as well. I think there's interesting. Dan Tompkins from the Justice Department asked a question which. Let me just, we'll try to run through these questions with maybe 1 or 2 answers apiece, but let me just throw it out to the panel. We've got a new generation of tasers, says Dan. M26 are many times more powerful than the predecessors. Kind of, how does that fit in with the continuum of force you talked about? What's that do to training, and are you recommending to departments they take more powerful tasers because of this leather coat issue, or does that present too many risks? Who was it that did the continuum of force response on our panelists?
Was that...
Bob Kaminsky was chatting about it mostly.
Bob Kaminsky, I think.
Bob, you still there?
Yeah. Well, I'm probably not really qualified to give an answer, but my understanding is that the new tasers actually are less powerful in some sense, current-wise, although they're more effective. And I forget how it works with the amperage and the volts and so forth. So my understanding is, from the cursory look that I've done, is they're more effective than the prior models, but less risky. I don't know if anybody else can address that part of it.
This is Clark Kimmer. That's absolutely accurate. They are not ultimately more powerful. They're actually less joule output than the previous version of them. Their enhancements include consistency of current. They have a lower risk of secondary effects, and their data port and other systems are improved. Plus, they're smaller and easier to handle. So we're actually not looking at the next generation being ultimately more powerful and, as a consequence, more potentially hazardous or risky.
Commander Johnson asked, and I think Winter's putting this up on the site, does anybody know whether, or maybe Deborah, maybe you'd have an answer to this, is there a model policy under consideration anywhere that we could direct interested people to?
I think what we hope is that by furthering these public discussions, some model policy may develop. We don't like to be in the business at the Department of Justice in developing a model policy and trying to sell it to folks. We are, by the way, however, going to try to take this discussion and make it a part of a larger symposium that we're going to put on, we believe, in April. This is still in the works. To try to get people talking about this issue, to share with regard to less lethal technology and this continuum of force, all the information that we have readily available, so that policies can be developed, and I think a model will probably emerge.
Chief Huff has asked, since you're the Justice Department, are there updates? And we're going to show everybody when we sign off in a couple of minutes a site we have with the bibliography and places for questions. But Deborah, you or any of your associates have a summary of pending litigation, rather? I'm sorry, not legislation, litigation that the department could find?
We can work on putting that together. I don't know, do you think that we have that now? I don't think we've been looking at litigation. We could collaborate with the Civil Rights Division in terms of identifying pending litigation because they tend to track that.
Okay, well, maybe when we talk about where we can go to get information, that may be one of the action items that would help people. Let me ask, Chuck, before I turn it back over to you and Deborah for a final comment, let me ask, we do two things. Take one more question and ask Winthrop to tell everybody where they can get more information. But does anybody on the call know, is there a central place where this issue has been addressed with respect to the use of less lethal force in the correctional setting? Where's the best place to go for those answers? Anybody?
This is Bob Kaminsky. I'm not aware of a central repository. I know NIJ did fund, and I think it was through the Office of Science and Technology, they did fund a study on the use of less lethal weapons in corrections. And it is available for download through the NCJRS. It was a few years ago. It might have been, about
you put that up?
6 years ago, 5 years ago, something like that.
We can make that kind of information available. One of the things that we'll tell everyone is that, and I think Winthrop, I may be stealing your thunder here, but that information from this discussion will be available on this website on an ongoing basis. So we can continue to feed those kinds of links to the website, and we'll look for that.
That'd be great, Deborah. We've got a couple interesting things. One, Winthrop has posted a note from Miami-Dade that they're working on a model, some model policies, which would be helpful. Maybe we can, when they're done, we can incorporate those on the website. And we have another note here from I can't tell if it's Commissioner Velez, that underscoring that pending litigation would be really helpful, because as their department tries to address these issues, they want to at least avoid the landmines. So let me ask Winthrop to appreciate everybody. This is the first time we've put all this technology together, and this is Steve Goldsmith from the Harvard Kennedy School, and we really hope to do it on a continuing basis on topical issues, and you all have been our first test market. So we very much appreciate what Department of Justice and Chuck have done. I know Deborah is in the later part of her term at Office of Justice Programs, and when I was a district attorney and mayor, I really depended on their work and empirical research. So I appreciate her terrific work. And Chuck, you and Deborah can have the last words just as soon as Winthrop shows people how to get more information after we sign off.
Good. Okay. Thank you. And I'll add that we do appreciate your having participated, and we will be following up with a questionnaire to get your input, so that we can continue to improve these presentations. Now, what you should see on the screen is our portal site, Government Innovators Network. That's innovations.harvard.edu, and you can register for this site. And if you do so, when we do new events and post new materials that are of interest to you, you can get emails about that, and also have access to other activities and resources that we'll be offering moving forward. Now, what I'd like to show you specific to less lethal force is what, in collaboration with the Department of Justice, we have researched and posted here on the site 2 categories of information. We have a bibliography of recent media coverage on less lethal, and I'm going to just briefly show you that. You can get to it through the site, clicking through the same way that I am, or simply do a keyword search on the site for less lethal. So we've compiled a list of recent media coverage. In addition, we have also compiled, let me get you back to that, a list of annotated research, documents, reports, academic literature. All of those that are available online have already been uploaded to the site as individual documents. So what you're able to do is either look at this list and get them from other sources, or get them from us. And that document is called Resources, Less Than Lethal Technology. In addition, what I'd like to show you, I'll show you some of the documents we actually have on there. And so here's a list, what you're seeing, of from a variety of sources, including from Great Britain, National Security Research, from a variety of sources, including the Department of Justice, the National Institute of Justice. We have a couple things here from the Kennedy School as well, so quite a bit of information for you on this topic here. We will also be posting the PowerPoints from our presenters, and I'll just close by telling you that this presentation has been recorded, and we will archive the entire presentation on the site as well.
And Winthrop, is there a way they can give us feedback? A couple of people want to know whether there'll be another session, so we'd kind of like to get some ideas from the audience what they'd like to see next. So after we get the answer, then we can post it on the site and also notify the people who registered about what might be coming up.
Sure. Yes. 2 things. We will be in touch with you, and so we'll be connecting with you. We've got your registration information. You can send us emails to the Innovations Network, all one word, Innovators Network, at ksg.harvard.edu. So Innovators Network at ksg.harvard.edu. With your comments and requests for information. And again, if you register on the site, you'll get automatic updates on new activities. And we'll look forward in our questionnaire for your input and recommendations for how to take this to new levels.
Chuck and Deborah?
Well, at this point, let me just jump in. Clearly, this is Deborah and not Chuck. To thank, in particular, Steve Goldsmith. Steve's work over at least the last 25 years and his creativity has done a lot for law enforcement, and we're honored that OJP could partner with Steve and Harvard on this effort. We're grateful to, of course, all our commenters today who've, I think, have already added quite a bit to the public discussion in this area, and to Chuck for facilitating this. We certainly hope you've gotten something out of it. It won't be the last of these discussions, and it won't be the last of this particular discussion. So thanks to all of you. Chuck, any last words?
Yeah, I just want to thank everyone there at Harvard and the Justice Department, and just PERF will have a report coming out in April, privately supported on use of force and mass demonstrations. And just one word, and that is, I think the research in this area is really important. I know the police chief's on the line. Really think that's important, that we get the research out there rather than the manufacturers. And so thank you all very much, my presenters. Thank you all. And I'll turn it back to you, Steve and Deborah, and thank you for the opportunity.
All right, I think we're done. Thanks for joining. Chuck, you did a lot of work. The presenters were terrific. Email us your questions, and we'll have a little conference here between PERF, OJP, and the presenters, and figure out what to do next. And thanks so much to everybody. So long.